it wasn't for residential building. Okay, so even though the community was already there, it was zoned as being in an area that wasn't for houses, for residents. Okay, so it was after the fact it was deemed illegal by the state. Now the Israeli state will say, okay, but many of these communities are small, and it wouldn't be sustainable to connect all of these small communities up to the system, etc. And you can tell that that is a disingenuous argument, because you also look at the Negev and you see single-family Jewish farms established and connected up with the modern road network and the electricity, etc., etc. Now, most recently, the reason why more people have started to understand what's been happening in the Negev is because the Israeli government is proceeding with a plan, the Prava plan, that looks set to mean the forced expulsion of 30 to 40,000 Bedouin people in the Negev area. Okay, we don't know the exact number because the Israeli government hasn't published yet the list of villages that will be completely destroyed. But the idea is to force all the people living in those villages deemed to be destroyed into a few government-approved shanty towns that have been established a number of years ago and that are some of the poorest communities within Israel. And this is all occurring in the name of development, right? The official rubric of the Prava plan says that it is for the development of the Negev for all its citizens. And if you want a good example of what's really going on there, you only have to look to events a few days ago when the Israeli cabinet met in a special session in the Negev. They chose to meet on purpose in the same place that Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, used to live. And in that cabinet session down in the Negev, they approved the creation of a new Jewish community in the Negev. Okay, the only problem or hitch being to that plan is that they approved it in a location where there is right now a Bedouin Palestinian village, which is set to be destroyed and all of its residents expelled. And that even shocks liberal Zionists, so you know it's going to be bad. Shimon Peres, who has for some reason a reputation as a liberal in the West, he said this in 2005, although this came out in WikiLeaks, because he tends not to say this kind of thing in public. He said Israel had lost land in the Negev to the Bedouin and would need to take steps to relieve the demographic threat. Okay, remember, you've got a guy who right now is the president of all the citizens, apparently, but actually he views some of the citizens of his own state as constituting a threat based on their race. That's a picture from Al-Araqib, which is in the Negev. It's a village that has become famous, I guess, because of the numbers of times that Israeli state forces have destroyed it and the number of times that residents have returned to rebuild it. Okay, so starting in 2010, so it's been going on for over 3 years. Summer 2010 it began. It's been demolished about 50 times, more or less. And it's become a kind of focus point for a lot of Bedouin resistance to the kind of policies that the state's been implementing in the Negev. I think for me, one of the sort of shocking aspects of these kinds of pictures is the way in which when you look at them, if you didn't know where they were from, it looks more like something from the Gaza Strip, right? It looks more like something from the days of the Second Intifada in Rafah or somewhere like that. But this is actually in the Negev, right? Inside like so-called democratic Israel. Here's another key component of ways in which Palestinian citizens are discriminated against. You have the role of so-called admission committees, which function in about 70% of Israeli communities. These are small communities, often rural-based, and they end up controlling a large amount of land relative to their population size. And they have these admission committees functioning that allow or deny someone to live there based on social suitability. And you can probably see how that ends up being used. In the words of Human Rights Watch, the international NGO, admission committees have notoriously been used to exclude Arabs from living in rural Jewish communities. Now that role of the admission committees is now legislated for in about 40% of cases. Okay, that was a law that was passed a few years ago, sort of enshrining in legislation the role of the admission committee. When that law was passed, as the members of Knesset debated it, those pushing forward that law were very clear about why it was important to have admission committees. And this is the words of one Kadima member of Knesset. He said that the purpose of admission committees was to, quote, preserve the ability to realize the Zionist dream in practice, which is a very exotic way to talk about planning legislation. But what that politician is saying is that the Zionist dream in practice means excluding Palestinians in order to have Jewish communities. And the extra irony here, the dark irony, is that a lot of the communities that have admission committees were themselves built on the land of ethnically cleansed Palestinians. Finally, I wanted to mention, within the context of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the law that has been around for about a decade now that separates families, that separates spouses. And what it means is that it's difficult or impossible for an Israeli citizen, and of course this ends up in practice almost exclusively applying to Palestinian citizens, for them to live legally with a spouse, a husband or a wife, if they have West Bank or Gaza ID. Okay, so a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza. And when that law was implemented, it was implemented as a temporary emergency measure, and some of the justification given for it was on the grounds of so-called security, which I'm sure you're familiar with as an excuse for a lot of stuff. And the justification went, some Palestinians are gaining citizenship through marriage from West Bank and Gaza, and they go on to commit terrorist acts, and therefore we have to stop that happening. Now, even putting aside the fact that you could argue that the security services should maybe assess on an individual basis rather than on a blanket ban, but even putting that to one side, as the years have gone on, supporters of this separation of spouses have been more explicit about the fact that their rationale for this law is actually part of the so-called demographic battle. Okay? When NGOs appealed the law and it went up to the High Court, the Israeli High Court, again for reasons that I don't understand, is understood as a bastion of liberalism, ended up defending the law and rejecting the appeal of human rights groups. And the majority opinion of the court included language like this: human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. Okay? Human rights are not a prescription for national suicide. And you look at that language and look at the context in which they're using it, what the High Court is saying is that yes, we recognize that it is an infringement of these families' human rights, but that there is a more important thing here which makes that an okay reality. And the more important thing is preserving Israel as a Jewish state and having something that plays a role in that demographic battle. One of the Knesset members, praising the High Court's ruling, explained it in these terms, that it's about, quote, the separation between the peoples and the need to maintain a Jewish majority and the Jewish character of the state. Again, think about it, make a comparison. Think about it if you heard a politician in the US using some kind of equivalent language and how they would be viewed in the political spectrum. And just as a little comparison here, take a look at the words from Apartheid South Africa, one of the key parties' political platforms when it was being formalized. Either we must follow the course of equality, which must eventually mean national suicide for the white race, or we must take the course of separation. So those have been some examples of Israeli policies that discriminate against and impact on the lives of Palestinians who have got Israeli citizenship. So it's kind of as good as it gets, right, in the context of Israeli apartheid. And here are some examples of how Israeli policies have affected Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, of course, those areas have been under Israeli military rule for almost half a century now, which means that if you're a Palestinian who's under 50 years old in the West Bank and Gaza, Israeli military occupation is all you've ever known. There'd be too much to go into a lot of detail on these examples, but here's just one example of what it's like to be a Palestinian in East Jerusalem, which is occupied territory that Israel has unilaterally and illegally annexed. Palestinian residents who haven't got West Bank ID or Israeli citizenship for the most part face planning restrictions, home demolitions, discriminatory municipal services, and also, of course, the apartheid wall that has gone right through and shattered many Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. In many cases, separating people who previously had a shop on the other side of the road, or family, or a school, and now there's the wall running right through the street. The mayor of Jerusalem, who was recently re-elected in municipal elections near Barakat, openly believes that there is an ideal ethnic ratio that should be maintained in the city. He openly believes in the idea of maintaining a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. That's the elected mayor of what the city that Israel claims is its capital, openly saying there is an ethnic majority that I want to maintain here. Imagine if that was the case in London or New York or Los Angeles, whatever it is. you expand the vision to like include all of the West Bank too, you're looking at 500,000 Israeli citizens living in illegal settlements that have been established since '67 in this sort of network of colonies that I'll show you a map of in a moment. And alongside that colonization process has gone this regime that restricts Palestinians' freedom of movement through both physical obstacles and a bureaucratic permit system. Okay, so until today, there are around 500, a bit over 500 physical obstacles to Palestinian movement, which includes checkpoints that have the physical presence of soldiers, or maybe it's just a big pile of dirt or rocks blocking a track so that cars can't pass, or trenches dug into the ground, gates, etc., etc. All these things are dotted around the West Bank until now. And alongside that, you've got the bureaucratic permit regime to which Palestinians have to apply in order to get the permit to move from A to B. And then, of course, you've got the apartheid wall itself, most of which is inside the West Bank, inside occupied territory. And within the context of the apartheid wall, very important to be familiar with or to look up the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which meets in The Hague, sits in The Hague. In 2004, so almost a decade ago now, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion on the wall, as had been requested by the UN's General Assembly. Their advisory opinion, the judges, all of them except one, who was the American, said that the wall was illegal in its entirety, so long as it is inside occupied territory, ordered its immediate dismantlement, compensation paid to Palestinians, etc., etc. The ICJ advisory opinion is also good. It's a good resource for looking at the illegality of the settlements too, because the court looked at that issue as well. In 60% of the West Bank, which is referred to as Area C because of the way in which the Oslo Accords sort of mapped out the territory, all the Palestinians in that area have to apply to the Israeli military for a building permit. And I'm not talking about sort of a block of apartments or a big mansion, but you have to get a permit even if you're talking about a simple shelter for some animals or a tent or something like that. And if you don't get the permit and you build illegally, then the Israeli military can come along and demolish it. Now, okay, that means that because there is a legal system that the occupation set up, they'll say that these demolitions are just carrying out the letter of the law and that Palestinians should have just applied for a permit. When the UN did a survey that looked at over a period of about 7 years, they found that 94% of all applications submitted by Palestinians in Area C were denied by the Israeli authorities. 94%. So in other words, it's a system that is designed to fail from the Palestinian point of view and to create a legal facade for the demolitions that then follow. To give an example, in 2011, over 600 Palestinian-owned structures demolished inside the West Bank. And that year, European Union observers, the EU, very good at issuing reports, really bad at doing anything about them, they talked about what they described as forced transfer of the native population. Okay? Just let that language sink in. Forced transfer of the native population is what the Israeli authorities are doing in the occupied West Bank. Human rights, once again, look at the language that they're using. Israel's regime in the West Bank is, quote, a two-tier system where Palestinians face systematic discrimination. And then there's the Gaza Strip, obviously physically disconnected from the West Bank, home to around 1.8 million Palestinians, the majority of whom are a refugee population. Many Palestinians living in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip are actually a few kilometers, a few miles away from the lands and the villages from which they were expelled in 1948. It's fenced in, subject to blockade. The restrictions on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip actually go right back to the early 1990s, but were became much harsher, of course, in like the late 2000s. Now, here's an aspect that is important to realize, particularly when it comes to the conversation about so-called security rationale that Israel gives for its policies towards the Gaza Strip. Okay? Justifies many of these aspects of the blockade on the grounds of security. But until now, until today, almost all exports from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank are prohibited by Israel on the grounds of separation, or a separation policy. That's the language that the Israeli military itself used in documents that NGOs were able to get released. Okay? So is there a security rationale for preventing an armchair manufactured in Rafah or Gaza City being sold in Ramallah or Naples? No. It's a deliberate policy of economic punishment, and it's part of a wider context of seeking to separate the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And another example of that, for example, is prohibiting Palestinians from the Gaza Strip studying in West Bank universities. And of course, the Gaza Strip is also where you can see Israeli apartheid at its most brutal, where Palestinians can be massacred by the Israeli army with impunity, where war crimes take place, as we've seen, unfortunately, on more than one occasion over the years. Now, I'm assuming that you can see this, okay, find the map. I'm just going to go through a sequence of maps that were produced by the United Nations as a way of showing you the different ways in which Israel has colonized and eaten up the West Bank over the last decades. Okay? This first map, you can see sort of burgundy, I guess, I don't know what colors come out of that, like burgundy red dots on, all across the West Bank, which are the built up parts of the settlements. Okay, so those are the colonies themselves. Now a little bit of red is added now, and that is areas that is taken up by unauthorized settlements. Settlements so illegal, even the Israeli government thinks they're illegal. The next bit of red that is taken up is agricultural areas that are for the exclusive use of the Jewish settlements. The next area of red that is off limits to Palestinians is reserved by the Israeli military for training purposes in. That next bit of red is marked as like a nature reserve, so it's also restricted for Palestinian use. The next area of red, you might be able to guess, is now the other side of the apartheid wall, and that gives you an idea of its route, of course, as well. And that next area of red, like the crisscrossing area all across the West Bank, it's the road network controlled by Israel that links up all the other elements of the colonization process together. And when you put all of those different pieces together, that's what you've got left of the West Bank in terms of where Palestinians are able to exercise this very problematic kind of autonomy. You can see that intentionally, over the last few decades, Israeli policies have been designed to make sure that there can't be an independent Palestinian entity within this area. Now, to give you a zoomed-in look at Jerusalem quickly, which is just two maps, this is a map from 1987, looking at the area of the Old City, then expanding around to include East Jerusalem, which is the sort of dashed dotted line. So that's the boundary that Israel has unilaterally declared to be the expanded boundaries of Jerusalem. And you can see again like the kind of purple blobs that are around, marking the settlements. Okay, those are the settlements around Jerusalem, and that is in 1987. Now look at the difference between 1987 and 2005. That's what happened around Jerusalem between 1987 and 2005. You can see that settlements that already existed expanded to a large extent, and settlements that hadn't even been created at that point were made. And the Israeli policy towards the colonization of that area has been designed to make sure that East Jerusalem, Jerusalem, is separated from the rest of the West Bank through this kind of semicircle of colonies. Okay, so I'm just going to come to the last section called Rethink to Reimagine, which is where I'm going to hopefully just provide some ideas to kind of group all this together and provide some thoughts about how it could be different as well. So I want to talk about what I've referred to as making the links and the invisible green line. Now, I don't know how many people here automatically know what I mean by the green line, but just in case, it is the border or boundaries, it doesn't really exist in practice, between Israel pre-1967 and after 1967. So everything over the green line is considered occupied territory of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Now, what do I mean by the fact that the green line is invisible? I mean two things. Number one, Israeli colonization since 1967 has in many places, if not everywhere, rendered the green line an irrelevancy. Okay, you can see from the map from before the ways in which so many pieces, large pieces of the West Bank, have been incorporated into the Israeli state structure, but the green line became an irrelevancy in terms of any kind of demarcation line. Okay, you can drive from Tel Aviv to Ma'ale Adumim or to Ariel, another colony. You're going over the green line, but from an Israeli citizen's point of view, there's not much difference, right? The second way in which the green line is invisible, and this is maybe more important for what I'm trying to communicate here, is the way in which Israeli policies towards the Palestinians have got the same goal in mind on both sides of the so-called green line. Okay, in other words, you've got the same